make sure the business is scalable without you. So this kind of feeds on, don't create yourself a job. Yes, initially the business is going to need you. It's going to need you for the first year, 2 years, 3 years. But really, if the business is dependent on you doing the work, you can't really grow the business or work on the business. So if you're the one cleaning the pools, if you're the one that's, running the front counter, if you're going to be the main chef at the restaurant, it's not ideal because it's not scalable. There's only so many restaurants you can open. And right from the beginning, you need to find something that's scalable. Theoretically, everything's scalable, but certain businesses are much more scalable than others without you. So yes, you could run around all day long, but the goal of it is for you, it's not, below you to work in your business, but I'm going to make the argument that it's better for you to work on your business than work in your business. Maybe the first year, yes, you work in the business because when you hire other people and train other people, you need to know the business as though you're an employee and you've worked there. So initially, yes, most businesses, you are going to have to do everything. But try to look at the business model and say, if this grew, would I need to be there? And at the end of the day, the most scalable businesses are the ones that can scale without you, because there's only one you, and that cannot be the rate limiting. Plus, as the business grows, your ability to focus on higher level issues will have a much bigger impact on the business than your ability to literally get in the weeds and solve problems. And then we'll have other talks about how to hire people and how to create an organization. All of that will hopefully be in future episodes. But for now, I just want to let you know, if you look at a business and the business is going to involve you being there in perpetuity, you may want to look somewhere else, because especially if you already have a job and you're trying to get to the point where you can be more creative, you can let your entrepreneurial side run wild and think outside the box and solve problems and disrupt things and create innovations. You're not going to be able to do that very well if you're in the grind, behind the counter or wherever. You're going to want to be more focused on that. So to leave you with that, find a business that's scalable eventually without you. Again, the caveat, I would say the first year or two, that probably doesn't apply, but at some point can grow without you.
Right. As long as you're talking about the description, do you think on balance it's better to overshoot the importance of the position than undershoot it? Because sometimes I see ads for administrative clerk. How many people are waking up saying, I want to be an administrative clerk? But and I think we have learned that, where you don't call it administrative clerk, you can say assistant director to, or assistant to the director, or, because often that is what it really is, but we just call it literally what they're be doing, but not how important they are. And tell us about that job title versus,
it's a great topic. Because I look at the job descriptions, and we've been, I'd say, guilty of it ourselves. If it's a basic title job description, we're like, how do we jazz that up? And so even if it's production worker, people understand what a production worker is. It doesn't need to be assistant to a lead in production, or something of that. We're trying to sass it up a little bit. No, be as honest as possible. One of my pet peeves, I will say this, and not just mine, I think a lot of people's, is you think you have to keep some type of secret within the job description. Ooh, let's get folks to look at it, and they'll look at it if we don't put a pay rate on there. Wrong. They're not looking if you don't put rates, at least a range. Right. Depending on what it is. But there's no stick and carrot game, because as an employer, you're the one, what is the actual position that you're doing?
So how do you build culture? The first thing you have to understand in building culture in any organization is to see who you already have in an organization. Now, we divide up most people in our organization as two types of people. People who are amazing people, but they're clocking in and out, versus people who are owners, who really feel like this is their company. Now, we'll have other podcasts about how to convert people in your organization to owners. But first, let's just talk about what happens when you have predominantly people who are clocking in and out and versus organizations where you have predominantly people who are owners. If you're in an organization where 80, 60, 70, 90% of people are clocking in and out, any person you bring into the organization is going to feel the pressure to conform to the majority of people who are clocking in and out. And by the way, they may be doing a great job, but they're still clocking in and out. So the flip side of it is if you have an organization that the majority of people are owners and you bring in someone who wants to clock in and out or who comes with that background or expectation, they're going to feel tremendous amount of pressure to conform and either become an owner or leave the organization. So what happens in these kind of things where 80, 90% of the people are predominantly renters, as we call them, versus owners, any new person coming into the organization will feel like a renter. And same thing in the other organization where predominantly everyone's an owner and somebody comes in, they're going to feel a lot of pressure to be an owner or leave. These are how these organizations actually perpetuate itself, by having a predominant ownership versus renter mentality. And that is SEO. Why is that important? Well, most companies on some level, especially small to medium, can make or break their company depending on how well their website is. Of course, it depends what industry you're in. And if you don't fully understand what drives people to your website and how you can make your website grow, leaving it up to someone else is literally like, leaving up the fate of your company to other people. So on some level, you have to get involved. I know when I was starting out, I was very frustrated because as a regular business person, medical person, it's not something I knew about, how to drive people to the website or how to make our website work. And I was really frustrated. I was very frustrated because I would talk to people and I'd hear all this jargon about SEO. I didn't know what it meant. And so I didn't know who to trust. I didn't know what was the right thing to do. And it's a pretty nebulous field to begin with, right? So for someone who is not in that space, it's even worse. I actually did something really crazy. I actually started to go to SEO conferences for SEO people, just so I could see what they were talking about. And of course, that was a big investment of time, but the companies we were involved in, we were living and dying by our website traffic. So for me, it kind of made sense. But going to those conferences, I learned what I at least need to know, what the lingo is and what kind of questions to ask and what the pitfalls are. And I'm going to talk about the SEO industry because I don't want to say it's on par with used car sales, but it's pretty close, especially if you just randomly get involved with SEO with some random people. It's not for the faint of heart. It can be very treacherous, and there's a lot of people out there who are just making money on it, but not providing a whole lot of value. So if you as the CEO don't at least have a handle on it, I can tell you, in terms of your website and traffic and growth, you're probably going to pay a price. So is it worth for you to learn a little bit so you can manage the people who are doing your SEO and ask the right questions and make sure you're not wasting money and make sure you're not hurting your website? Is there truly an upside for ownership? And this is really tricky because I've met a lot of people who've kind of have given that commitment just for whatever reason, and done it for 10 years, and it has gone unnoticed maybe, or after 10 years, basically, the company either folded and closed or they got laid off. So I think there is a danger sometimes where people say, look, if I even give this, is anyone going to recognize it, and will I have an upside? And this is where your mentoring comes into place, right? Because you have to then say, look, this company does recognize it. We really do. We look for it, we validate it, we promote it, and then we compensate appropriately. So if a certain person is responsible for, increasing the revenues of your company or growing your base or your clients, they need to, maybe not the next day or the next week, but at some point, if they're responsible for part of the reason, why your company is growing, I think it's incumbent on you to compensate them, not only financially, but professionally, in terms of promotion, status, title, financial. But I think there has to be, at some point, a correlation between if they're taken care of and their sense of ownership. Because if you really think about it, that's what ownership really is, right? I mean, if you're the owner of a pizzeria and this year you sold 10,000 pizzas and next year you sold 30,000 pizzas, what's going to happen to your bottom line? I mean, assuming everything else is equal, it's going to improve. So owners get that positive feedback when they're successful. So my argument will be that staff that act like owners and cause the company to grow actually need that positive feedback just the same way as an owner. What's interesting is owners often don't get the feedback right away. You can imagine an owner who, let's go back to the pizzeria, sells 30,000 pizzas the next year, but decides to take all that money, reinvest it into better equipment, open up a new location. So again, this idea of ownership, is not sort of meant to be a direct one-to-one correlation, but over the long term, it has to correlate. In fact, I would be very weary and skeptical of people who come and say, look, I've been here for a year, our revenues have grown 20% and you should talk to me about compensating me more. That's actually a red flag. What's interesting is the ones that are owners, it's kind of not what you would think, rarely are focused on their own compensation to that direct, correlation. The ones that have it really tied down are probably the ones that are sort of pretending to care and pretending to be owners, because the people who genuinely own a business understand unexplained expenses come up, we're going to reinvest the money, and they're in it for the long haul. Owners are in it for the long haul versus people who are not owners, who want this immediate feedback correlation between the effort they're putting in. And I try to mentor a lot of young people because I get this where, I've talked to people who say, what, I killed it for the company. So this year I'm going to go into my annual meeting and I'm going to really, put, draw a line in the sand that I need to be compensated. And I really argue against that necessarily, unless they're really in a company that long-term is not going to acknowledge it, which then raises another issue. But this sort of one-to-one correlation, because owners don't get one-to-one correlation, but here, now the flip side is, but over the long term, there should be a definite correlation. People only become owners if the people on the other side of the equation appreciate that and are grateful for that and reward that, right? Because at the end of the day, what's in it if you are going to give of yourself and then really see nothing as a result of it? In other words, not even a tit for tat, but if you go into an organization and really give of yourself above and beyond the call of duty, not necessarily working more than 40 hours a week, but having a sense that you're going to put out the same product as you would as if you owned the company, which is a pretty high bar, and which is what I've already described in the previous episode, which, by the way, I'll provide a link for so you can, if you haven't seen that, and also will be in the description, about, why should you become an owner? Why should you give of yourself if your organization doesn't necessarily value it, is not grateful for it, doesn't necessarily want it, especially your direct boss or the main leader of the organization? If that's not where their mindset is, it's hard to imagine a scenario where people say, I'm going to, give that extra mile when it doesn't even get noticed or acknowledged. It's interesting, though, the people who do give the extra mile aren't necessarily saying, I need a tit for tat. Every time I do something, I need a raise, I need acknowledgement. But broadly speaking, over the course of time, if those kind of efforts are not acknowledged, if you're not grateful for it, if you don't appreciate it, long term it's just simply not going to work. But starting off with my number 1 and number 2 rule. My number 1 rule in negotiation is always negotiate in good faith. And that's a really tough one to put into a few words, but basically you want to be a legitimate partner in the negotiation. So if you really are not serious or don't have the capacity to deliver on what you're saying, probably behooves you not to negotiate. This idea that someone's negotiating in good faith means that they really are at the table, they really want to cut a deal, and they want a win-win. Now what's interesting is when you come across someone across the table who's not negotiating in good faith, that's often very easy to recognize and leaves a really bad taste in people's mouth, where you just say, this party just doesn't really want to do a deal, or is wasting my time, or is just a bottom feeder who just wants everything to be their way. So if you're not prepared to do a win-win deal where both sides come out ahead, you're probably not going to be negotiating in good faith. So be cognizant of that. Before entering any of these situations, just ask yourself, is this a deal I want to do? Can I afford this deal? Can I deliver what I'm going to promise? And can I set up an arrangement that's win-win? So negotiating in good faith is a key point.
Today, we have a bulletproof system that helps us close up to 80% of those inbound calls. Our high converting call class will teach you how to demonstrate your authority quickly without being pushy. We believe that many businesses out there can benefit from this, and we promise to help you achieve your revenue goals by converting more of your incoming calls into actual sales. For more information, please visit our website at highconvertingcallclass.com. Stop waiting for the sales to come to you. Put your revenue into your hands.
The third strategy to use when you don't have leverage is try to reverse engineer what a win would look like for this other company or person, right? So be in their shoes. Now that you know how their business works, what's important to them. Often you need to have a better understanding, and this should direct if you're doing a PowerPoint presentation. For example, some companies, a win for them is if they are able to get more market share. So volume might be important to them. Other companies, it's important that they have higher margins. So margins might be important. Some other companies, it's the type of business. We tend to do more casual clothing rather than formal clothing. Every business has a sweet spot that they rather be in, and you need to understand that. Other companies only want to work with companies that are rapidly growing versus have already plateaued and are a stable company. They want to roll the dice with more startups. Other companies want to work with companies that are low maintenance. Once they get them as a client, they don't have to hold their hands. Sometimes it's the reverse. Sometimes they want companies who they have to hold their hands because they can charge more for that. So again, you're reverse engineering for what a win looks like for them, right? Sometimes people want, they're willing to do business with a company that can make a quick decision. Like, oh my gosh, everybody we meet with is a 12, 14 week process. But so their sweet spot is to find clients that, maybe not ideal on other points, but they're ready to make a deal that day. So conveying that in the sort of reverse engineering can make a difference. Some people like to work with companies who are tech savvy versus people who aren't. Again, I'm randomly picking things. Some companies are willing to work with companies that are flexible, that are not rigid, and can make decisions. The decision makers are in the room, and they can, if they need to tweak the arrangements, someone can say yes. So there's more, and a lot of these are abstract, but as you create your PowerPoint, on some level you have to pretend you're them, and you want to highlight the points that is in their sweet spot, and of course minimize the points that is not going to be a win. What's interesting when I try to distill this, the one thing I always tell people is if you're looking to figure out what kind of product you should put out as you join an organization, the best way to really do this is reverse engineer it, right? Because one day you're going to be the boss, right? Why not? So when you become the boss, who are you going to surround yourself with, right? If you can answer that question, it makes putting out the product that we're talking about a lot easier, because if you're not prepared to put out the product, right, that you would want if you were the boss, then there's something wrong. Because, oh, you're saying, well, if I was the boss, this is what I would want from, everybody around me. But when I'm not the boss, I'm gonna, maybe tone that down a little bit or give something other than that, right? Maybe I'll just do the bare minimum that will keep my boss off my back, or I'll do the bare minimum that gets the job done. And I think this often, you see it, especially with what happened the last few years when people are working remotely. Of course, some people do a great job working remotely, but then some people basically do enough that they can say they've done their job. And I think you often see this where people create a checklist. Well, if you're working remotely, if you can accomplish these tasks, then we consider that you're working efficiently or adequately. So not to pick on remote work for now, that's a whole separate topic. But I think a lot of people, when they think about the product that they want to put out, you want to put out the product that you would expect when you're the boss, okay? But now let's talk about how do you go about it. Well, the way you go about it is you go on Google or Bing or any of the other ones, and you set up an account, and you have to get familiar with their cloud-based software and how to set up your ads. To be truthful, this is probably the most daunting aspect of Google Ads. It's not complicated, but it will require you to spend a lot of time to become familiar with the software. I would liken it to Photoshop. If you know nothing about Photoshop and you wanted to go on there and start editing pictures, or if you wanted to start doing videos, you would have to spend some time to get the learning curve you need to learn Google Ads. So you either have to learn Google Ads, or someone in your team. Again, this talk is meant for CEOs. So as you're thinking about whether you want to approach Google Ads, you have to think, do I have someone in-house or someone in the leadership that understands Google Ads, understands the software, could navigate the software and get us the results that we want? It is very, very difficult to learn all the aspects of Google Ads software in a short couple of weeks. It takes months and sometimes even longer to become so proficient. Now, if you don't learn Google Ads and don't become proficient at it, and you just take a stab at it, more than likely you're going to be squandering a lot of money. So whatever your budget will be, you're going to wind up spending a portion of it on wasteful stuff if you haven't set up your campaigns, keywords, negative keywords correctly. So I'm going to talk about that. So we're going to talk about the 3 C's of Know Your Client. And those 3 C's are convey alignment, convey confidence, and convey value. So when do you start the process of getting to know your client? I would argue you should start it within 10, 15 seconds of starting that interaction. If they're calling, if they're in front of you, the Know Your Client phase begins right away. And I think the most common mistake people make in the Know Your Client phase is they answer the first questions. Usually, in any sales situation, somebody walks into your store, somebody calls you and immediately asks about your services, and of course, it'll be in the form of a question. But I would argue that not answering their first question, not as a sales tactic, but actually by understanding them better, will get you further. For example, you wouldn't walk into a bank and say, could you please tell me what the rate for a mortgage is, right? Because they're going to ask you, well, before we do, is this for a house? Is this for a condo? Is this for a primary residence? Is this for an investment property? So people understand that real professionals often don't answer their first question, and they actually interpret that question as meaning, give me more information. So when someone calls in and says, what is your mortgage rates? They don't really expect you, not knowing their credit score, not knowing how much they're putting down, to give you a rate. I think that's just a way that people use, like, please explain to me how your company moves forward and gives out mortgages. Explain the process to me. The number one CEO skill that I want to talk about today is actually not a skill, but a strategy, which is when you're first starting out, to seek a mentor or mentors. I find that a lot of people think being a CEO or being a leader is a soft skill, that if people just like you, if people respect you, if you're likable and get along with people, you will naturally be a good CEO. That's almost like saying, if we put you in a 747 at 30,000 feet in the cockpit, you're going to be able to land that plane because people like you and you're well respected. It's not true, obviously. You're going to need some skills to land a 747. And as long as people think being a leader is just a soft skill and is just a matter of being liked or respected or having a way of talking with people, even if you're charming and have a magnetic personality, there are skill sets you still need to be an effective CEO. So the first challenge that I think very few people will talk about, and I think you're probably going to hear it in this channel for the first time, is your first year or maybe longer is a period that's unique. And how it's unique is that often the people you bring on board in that first year will have no redundancy. And there's something I mean very specific. Often in the first year of life of a business, the positions that are created, there is no redundancy. If you go to a business that's been around for 10, 15 years, you go to the marketing department, there's 10 people in the marketing department. There's 20 people in the HR department. There's 10, And so if anything happens to any one person, there's resiliencies, there's redundancy. But almost by definition, the first year of a business, you often don't have much redundancy in the positions and in the roles. And that is going to be really different for you because often that first year you're trying to build culture, you're trying to build a standard. And sometimes if you don't really understand it, it becomes challenging to create culture, to run the business the way you want to, when most of the positions that you have in your small organization, there is no redundancy. And the best example I can give of that is, imagine you had 20 accountants in your accounting department. And there was this one accountant who was coming to work every day late. The quality of work wasn't up to snuff, blah, blah, blah. Well, you decide to have a conversation. You want to maybe coach this person, mentor them, and what have you. Well, that conversation that you're going to have with the 20th accountant in your accounting department is not going to be the exact conversation you're going to have if that person was the only accountant in your accounting department. Some people might argue, well, that's not true, but on some level, it can't always be the same. When you have one person in your organization which is running all the marketing, or you have one person, but they're not doing it the way you want, can you be frank with them? Can you coach them? Can you mentor them in the same way as if you had 20 people in the marketing department? And some people will give me blowback. Yes, oh yeah, I'm the same way. But you got to think about it. When someone is your only person that first year in the marketing department, you just can't talk to them the same way. I'm not saying don't be professional, don't be direct, but still, you have to calibrate and calculate, what happens even if I said professionally and nicely, and maybe I'm right on all the points, maybe they're not going to like what I have to say. And maybe they'll just pick up and leave it. And potentially, if there is no way to duplicate what they're doing with other people, unless of course it's you, but for now, just the more it can't be you, or the more, yes, it'll be you, but it'll be so much brain damage to do it, it will alter how you serve up this information. So one of the examples I can give you is, for example, let's take an attorney. You may have the world's best attorney. He may be able to win every case. He may be able to, understand the nuances of any, legal issue within a certain field of law. But if the person answering the phone comes off as someone who is not someone who's heavily involved in that industry, can't answer the most basic questions about, what are the breadth of services that you offer within that industry, you may lose a client because basically they're judging whether your firm or company are subject matter experts, not by the actual people, let's say on the back end, who are going to be doing the work. So you may go to an IT company and they may have the best IT persons that really are top notch and the best in the industry. But if the person answering the phone is unable to convey that, they've called the right place and you are the subject matter experts, you can only imagine what would happen, right? So always, sometimes having the best staff, having the best talent, if that's not conveyed somehow in that initial touch, it almost doesn't really matter, right? It doesn't matter how good these people are if the person who answers the phone is unable to take him through a process that conveys not only that they've called the right place, but that you've also asked them enough questions to understand their needs and wants to show what a professional you are and how good your company really is. All right, so let's talk about the first rule, which I mentioned already, which is never, 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 never answer the first question. And the reason for that is I don't know if you can give the proper answer unless you have more clarity. If somebody calls you up and says, "Are you open on Saturdays?" You think, well, that question I should answer. And let's just say you decide to answer, "No, we're not open on Saturdays." Well, that may not be true. Maybe you have not been open on, every Saturday for the last 10 years. But let me ask you a question. What happens if the guy calls and says, "Hey, are you open on Saturday?" And you say no, and they hang up, versus, "Are you open on Saturday?" Well, let me ask you, what are you trying to do? Well, we want to put $1 million order, but it needs to come in this Saturday. Well, guess what? Are you still not open on Saturday? I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. But if the guy just said he wants to do $1 million worth of business, and are you open on Saturday, or are you open on Sunday, or are you open on Thanksgiving? I don't know. So even when you're tempted to answer the first question, like, are you open on Sunday? Are you open on Thanksgiving? I don't know. If somebody wants to put a $100 million order, are you really closed on Thanksgiving? Next one is a tough one because I think it could be a video onto itself, and that is admitting when you're wrong. I think a lot of people who are in leadership view admitting when they're wrong as a sign of weakness, that they're not a great leader, but nothing could be further from the truth. So I want you to practice this next line, okay? Just practice it at home. You gotta be able to say to this other person in your mind, "You were right, I was wrong. You were right, I was wrong." You almost have to say that, okay? And believe me, nothing is worse than a boss who is wrong, but still wants to hold on to part of it. Yes, I was wrong, but you don't understand. Given the facts at the time, it doesn't, who cares? Come clean. And in fact, you will get more respect and not less. But I think there is this thinking saying that if I show that I'm having second thoughts about my thinking, let's say you went to the marketing meeting and say, "I think we need to push in this direction." And you made a big push and the data came back and nothing could be further from the truth. It helps to own that. Just say, guys, I do remember that meeting 2 months ago. I remember I pushed for this, and yeah, I'm here to tell you, boy, was I wrong. This idea that people will think less of you, if anything, you'll be elevated in the minds of many people, because they realize that you just have the best interest of the company. And just like them, if they made a mistake, you'd probably want to see that in them. But you have to set the example for, that it being a culture where someone can, admit they could have gone in a different direction and they didn't. And being wrong is not 100%. Sometimes you're just a little bit wrong. But even taking ownership of, I think I was on the same train with that and turned out to be wrong, and so I own that too. This concept that you were right, I was wrong, or I own that's 100% on me sometimes, are things you have to learn to say. If you are the head of an organization and you have never said, I own that mistake, I got that one, that's on me, or when someone had a conflicting view, saying, hey, you know what, you are spot on that, and I missed it on that one, okay? I totally missed it. I own that. This is the culture you need to be cultivating, because if you're talking like that, what does that do? It gives people permission for them to talk like that. But if you're always deflecting, minimizing, saying, well, that might have been, but I had 5 excuses for that. And what's the upside for mentioning your excuses? Whatever it was, who cares? Just take it anyway, right? Even if you in your mind thinking, oh, there is some rationale that I wasn't totally wrong. What's the upside of that at that point? Just say, you know what? I own that. I got it. Mine. Let me digest that to make sure I incorporate that into my decision making moving forward. Okay? On one sense, you do want to have checks and balances on your decision making, on your thinking, because sometimes you don't have all the information when you're trying to make the decision. But the flip side of it is, when you have made the decision, when you've taken everything in and you want to move in a certain direction, you don't want to have to get 15 people to sign off that, hey, we're going to be offering this new service, or we're going to be canceling that product, or whatever. So if done properly, if calibrated properly on the things that you're very certain that's the direction you want to go after getting all the information, you should be able to do that easily. The flip side is, if you're about to send the company off a cliff, there should be a way for people to communicate that back to you. So this is the fine balance, and it's almost as much of an art as it is a science to do that. What you really want to do is create a company that, after a lot of thought, is going to be the kind of company that, if you do everything right, makes your competitions irrelevant. You're not struggling for margins, and you're not in a blue ocean. You're not in a red ocean where you're stealing clients from one company to your company. I think I talked about in my previous videos that great book called Blue Ocean Strategies, where you want to create a company where really your competitors are irrelevant. And I think that's really the filter someone should use in creating a company. So if you're going to be the 10th accounting firm in a small to medium-sized company, by definition, you're going to be in a red ocean where you're, for the most part, going to be, stealing clients from one accounting firm to another, which is fine, and you can make a living on it. But it just doesn't have that endless potential if you come up with an idea or a company that is, in many ways, doesn't really have competition. Whether it's because of technology, because you've created the space, because you have some inside track on something. And really, when it comes to pricing, instead of calling it pricing for a product or service, and it doesn't matter what you are, if you're doing tax prep, or you're doing insurance, whatever. Pricing is not simply pricing. Pricing is really value. And I think when people hear value, they think about, the value you're going to give the customers, which is very important. But more importantly, I like to turn the whole thing on its head and talk about the value in terms of what it brings to your company. Meaning, when you select a price, there's a value to the customer you're selling it, and hopefully you're selling on value, but there's also a value of what that is worth to you, not only in dollars and cents, but over the things I'm going to go over. So let's talk about what goes into pricing / value and how these factors should help you determine your pricing model. Next, number 3, the reason to get a partner is to diversify the talents. You often hear partners talking about, I'm no good with the books, I'm no good with front-facing customers, I'm no good with operational stuff. And so what you can really do with a partnership is to focus on your strengths, and if done right, your weaknesses can be covered by someone who, for whatever reason, is stronger in that department than you. So diversified talent pool, even before you hire your first employee, is a huge, huge advantage, right? Today's topic is very interesting because it's not really talked about a lot, and that is business integrity and how it can impact your business, and specifically how it can impact your bottom line. What I want to talk about, and what I've learned in my travels, is that business integrity is fundamental for any company that's really going to have sustaining power and really grow. Because at the end of the day, people figure this out, whether your business has integrity. And I've mentioned it in my earlier videos, but personal integrity often is the precursor for business integrity. So what you often see in organizations where the leaders in their own personal lives or personally may have some issues, often that sets the tone and impacts business integrity in ways that sometimes are subtle and sometimes are not so subtle. So I think when we talk about business integrity, the first question is, what does it mean? And of course, it is kind of fluid, it's kind of vague, but I think we all know when we run into a business, and certainly people that have integrity, meaning they mean what they say, they're really looking out for themselves as well as you, as well as their staff, and they are going to be honest and truthful in their dealings with everybody, including clients, customers, partners, vendors, and the customers downstream from them. They're going to treat them the way they would want to be treated. They're going to convey the truth while still obviously marketing things, but convey the essence of their products or services in a way that a reasonable person would say, yes, they're being forthright. So let's talk about the 3 ways that integrity can impact people in your business. Once you find this no limit person, then that's your cue to invest time and energy in them, much more than you probably can comprehend. Because we're not talking about just a phone call here or there. We're talking about initially maybe hours a week, one-on-one. And what I think that involves is not simply them doing their work, but you spending quality time with them in going over things that maybe not directly related to their job description. And just training them for their job is not going to be enough. What you need, like I said, is for them to see you and have experiences other than their traditional job functions alone. The second thing that is really important is reliance and dependability. If people can't rely on you, if you're not dependable, one day you say one thing and the next day you say another, or you're late, or you have excuses for this and that, I think what happens is that even though you may be ultra competent, if they can't count on you, right? I mean, if LeBron James would show up late to a third of all his basketball games, it wouldn't really matter how good he is. He probably wouldn't be in the NBA. And that's an exaggeration, but you see that if you don't have reliability and dependency, that it will jeopardize even your competence. So you need competence, but then let's add the other missing ingredients, which is number 1, reliability and dependence. Being an entrepreneur means, of course, some downside, and the main downside is the financial risk, right? Because when you have a job, for the most part, your financial risks are mitigated by that position. But if you are an entrepreneur, really there is no theoretical limit to how much financial burden you may have to take on and financial risk. And with that financial risk comes also with the fact that you may often be the last person to get paid, especially when you're starting out. And if there's a financial crunch, you will be the last person to get paid, and potentially not get paid at all, and not paid for a long stretch of time. In addition, when you are the entrepreneur and this is your own gig, at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, the stress doesn't necessarily stop, or the thinking or the effort. Often when you have a career, at 5 o'clock when you're driving home, boom, all you're thinking about is, hey, are we having lasagna, or are we having, Chinese food tonight? And that's your biggest concern driving home. Often when you're in charge and it's your deal, you're not thinking about whether you're having Chinese food or pasta that night. You're thinking about, I never returned that email, or I got to call that guy back tomorrow. So your evenings, weekends, holidays, vacations are sometimes not your own, because you're always thinking and you're always on, essentially, especially in the early to mid stages of trying to start an endeavor. So if you really want success in your organization, what you really need to mentor for, what you really need to teach, is you need to teach people how to grow other people. So what I tell my senior leaders is spend a good part of the day not killing it yourself, which is of course important, but investing in others, right? Have them sit in on your meetings, on your strategy, soak in your culture, and also have them understand that it's not good enough for them just to kill it, but they're going to have or acquire the skills to pass it on to other people. What I would propose to anyone who's starting a company or has a moderate-sized company is you have to ask yourself, if my business doubled tomorrow, or if my business tripled tomorrow, with my current staff, would I be able to handle it? Now, certain businesses, where if you're running a restaurant, obviously the capacity is going to be, we're going to need more space, more chefs, more whatever. But for most companies who there isn't that direct correlation, it is possible often to double, triple, quadruple your business with the bandwidth you currently have if you've leveraged technology. And I think that's really one high-level way of viewing technology for a lot of businesses. This doesn't apply to all businesses, but for a lot of businesses, you have to ask yourself, if our business quadrupled, let's say by some miracle, whatever, one of our competitors goes out of business, we land on TV and all of a sudden our phones are ringing off the hook, what would happen? So really what often happens when people's business grows, they have two choices. They can hire more staff, more people, or they would have already invested in technology sometimes, which then can handle the extra work, right? It's not always that clear, but that often is the choices, right? So the argument I want to make is that it's not clear cut, that if you just get 9-to-5 job and don't really try to get ahead because it's going to infringe on your personal life or whatever, may actually be potentially hurting that personal life down the road, maybe in a decade, maybe in 2 decades, maybe in 3 decades. There may be things that, later on you can't do for your children or your family or your spouse or your community because of the resources that you have, or maybe you're going to be tied to that 9-to-5 job for the next 40 years. So in terms of travel freedom, time freedom, if you invest in creating something for yourself, whether it's inside of a company or outside of a company, in many ways, you can't rule out that actually is the optimal thing for work-life balance.